everyone, myself Ami Mehta, and let us understand what is router and what is components of router. So in networking, in communication purpose, router is a very important component and a very important device for communication purpose. So let us discuss the four parts of it. So router has four components: input ports, switching fabric, output ports, routing processor. So these are the four components of routers. Let us understand it by one. So the first, this is the routing processor. It is routing management control plane software, and it is forwarding data plane hardware. So this part is hardware, this part is software. Okay, and this part is hardware. So in hardware, this is input port, this is switch fabric, this is output port. So in hardware, total three component: input port, switch fabric, output port, and software it is routing processor. Input ports. An input port performs several key functions. What are that function that is performed by input ports? So it performs the physical layer function of terminating an incoming physical link at a router. This is shown in the leftmost box of the input port and the rightmost box of the output port in this figure. So this is the first box that it terminates the connection. Okay, and here also termination of the connection. So the main task is the connection with physical layer, and an input port also performs link layer function needed to interoperate with the link layer at the other side of the incoming link. This is represented by the middle boxes in the input and output ports. So this middle boxes which is responsible for link layer functions. So this is the task of the input ports. So perhaps most crucially, the lookup function is also performed at the input port. This will occur in the rightmost box of the input port. It is here that the forwarding table is consulted to determine the router output port to which an arriving packet will be forwarded via the switching fabric. So lookup function is also performed at the input port, and the forwarding table is also present, and it is related to determine the router output port. Okay, and control packets are forwarded from an input port to the routing processor. So from control packets means, for example, packets carrying routing protocol information. That information packets are forwarded from an input port to the routing processor. The next component is switching fabric. The switching fabric connects the router's input port to its output ports. This switching fabric is completely contained within the router, a network inside of a network router. So this is another network which connects the router's input ports to its outer ports. And the third component is output ports. So an output port store packets received from the switching fabric and transmit these packets on the outgoing link by performing the necessary link layer and physical layer functions. So when a link is bidirectional, an output port will typically be paired with the input port for that link on the same line card. So and the last component is routing processor. The routing processor executes the routing protocols, maintains routing tables, and attaches the link state information and computes the forwarding table for the router. So all the logical tasks like executing the routing protocols, maintains routing table, and attached link state information and computes the forwarding table for the router. It also performs the network management function. So these all are the 4 components of router and basic introduction of router. Now the next topic is IP addressing. So let us understand which are the components that is used in IP addressing. So we just see the basic introduction of IP addressing. So in IP addressing, the first component is IP address. So it is 32-bit identifier for host router interface. So from host, for example, this is host, this is router R. So for host router interface, a 32-bit identifier is required, which is IP address. What is interface? It is a connection between host, router and physical link. So this is interface, which is connection between host, router and physical link. Routers typically have multiple interfaces and a host typically has 1 or 2 interfaces. There is an IP addresses associated with each interface. Now what is subnets? So to determine the subnet, detach each interface from its host or router, creating island of isolated network with interfaces terminating the endpoints of the isolated network. So this each isolated network is called a subnet. The first task, when you detach each interface from its host or router, then creating island of isolated network with interfaces terminating the endpoints of the isolated network. Now this each of this isolated network is called a subnet. Subnet part. So the high order bits from we see that the 32-bit identifier for host. So the high order bits define subnet and low order bits define host. So this is the basic introduction of IP addressing. Now there are various protocol, that IPv4 datagram protocol, IPv6 datagram protocol, in which actually how IP addressing is constructed and how data is transferred using this IP address. But this is the basic introduction of router and IP addressing. Thank you.